George Robertson was the 10th Secretary General of NATO, and he was in that post on 9/11. George Robertson, who taught you history?
I actually didn't study history even at school. I had a binary choice between studying geography or history, and geography was easier, so I took geography. But then, towards the end of my secondary education, I decided to do an O grade, which they called them in Scotland, in history. And a man called Archie Blair was just brilliant. And he gave me a lasting appreciation of the subject of history and what it involved. And I credit him with a lot of what I've gained since then.
And do you feel, as when you were Secretary General of NATO in particular, that a sense of history was an important element of your job?
You're really crowded in by history. You're sitting at the desk of the Secretary General of NATO. It's quite amazing. I sat there occasionally thinking, what the hell am I doing here? Who sat round this table before? It was a breeze block building, constructed very quickly on the model of a hospital, because of course Charles de Gaulle had ejected NATO from its rather palatial headquarters in Paris, and the Belgians offered hospitality. So we were living in a building which, had it not been covered by the Ottawa Convention on Diplomacy, would have been condemned by the fire authorities. But my office was actually quite nice. But I did wonder why I was there. And you thought about all of the individuals who'd sat around that table at the same time. So yeah, you're there both with long-term history. Manfred Werner died as Secretary General of NATO during the Bosnian War. In fact, he had to be carried at one point into the North Atlantic Council. Desperately ill in order to chair one of the key meetings, but also very recent history, because Kosovo and Bosnia had not long happened, and we were trying to learn some of the lessons from that.
Well, and also, I suppose, Kosovo and Bosnia were both wars that, in a way, sprung up because of history and historical tension. So, did you have to sort of mug up on the past of those places to understand why Balkan internecine hatreds could break out into violence?
Absolutely. It was hugely important because, of course, I'd come from the Ministry of Defence in London as Secretary of State, where I actually sat at Churchill's desk, sitting in Churchill's chair, with Churchill's chaise longue on the other side of the room where he used to go to sleep. Michael Heseltine had rescued that furniture from some obscure storage point. So you were
Please tell me you had the occasional nap on it, George.
I couldn't possibly admit that at this stage. But the days were very long, and I'm quite accomplished at being able to sleep for 5 minutes at a time, though not when other people are speaking. I emphasize at this point. So yes, I was involved very intimately in the Balkan imbroglio, and I had to read it. One of the books I read was Fitzroy Maclean's Eastern Approaches, which is one of the best books on the Balkans. And Fitzroy Maclean, I knew, I'd met a couple of occasions, and indeed, when I worked on a relations farm in Argyll, Fitzroy Maclean's estate was neighbours of my uncles. So yeah, you had to know the history. And then when Kosovo came along, and I was at the Ministry of Defence and deeply involved at that time, I needed to know how all of this had started. The field of blackbirds and Milosevic's endless plumbing of the historical depths in order to justify the genocide he was involved in.
Your election to Parliament, to Hamilton South in the by-election of 1978, was one of my earliest political memories. I was 15 at the time, and I remember it happening. it seemed at the time to stop the rise of Scottish nationalism, of the SNP. You've always been a very firm unionist, of course, and you were Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland from 1993 to 97. Where do you think historically we are now with Scottish nationalism? My fear is about Scottish nationalism, a bit like the Royalists felt with Charles I, in that we need to win every battle, but they only need to win once.
Yes, that's very true, especially since David Cameron, in a magnificent negotiation where he gave away everything, agreed to Scotland becoming independent if they got one single vote more than the 50%. A quite remarkable concession at the time, and something that would never have been conceded anywhere else in the world. A huge constitutional earthquake based on a majority of one single vote out of the 3 million that would have been cast. Where are we now? I think we're still close to the edge of the cliff, but we've taken 2 or 3 steps back from it. I think that there is an entrenched view by about 30% of the Scottish population that will believe in independence irrespective of the facts. And there's another 30%, who will never concede it at all. And there is in the middle a fluctuating group of people who are yet to be persuaded. But the present turmoil of the Scottish National Party and the forces of independence has given, some breathing space for the argument to be put again.
In 1997, you became Secretary of State for Defence in the Blair government, and you instituted the 1998 Strategic Defence Review. Tell us about the Joint Rapid Reaction Force that was brought into existence as a result of that. It was created by that review, and it saw deployments in Sierra Leone and Macedonia and Afghanistan and elsewhere. What's your sense of that? You're the sort of the father of that, aren't you?
Well, the review was, and I've always said that if the 1998 review had been a success, it would be known as the SDR 1998, and if it had been a failure, it would have been called the Robertson Review. I'm very pleased to say that it's not referred to as the Robertson Review. And of course, the Joint Rapid Reaction Force was just one of many, very dramatic recommendations that were implemented as a consequence of that.
The other
review.
ones, of course, being the other major ones being the aircraft carriers, the Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers that are now in existence.
Well, that's right. And it, like the Joint Rapid Reaction Force, was about force projection, because at that time, that is what we said. There was a satirical program used to make mockery of my statement that, we have to wait to go to the war rather than waiting for the war to come to us. And that was the basis on which it was all done. But a Joint Rapid Reaction Force sounds radical, and yet why on earth would it sound radical? But it was radical because up until then, the Army, Navy, and the Air Force basically did their own things. The idea of jointly doing things together was relatively novel. The task force to the Falklands, that you have previously mentioned, was led by the Navy, despite the fact that the recovery of the Falklands took place with the Army. So one of the services had to take a lead and organize basically the expedition. So the whole concept of the permanent joint headquarters at Northwood was, which came before me, was radical. And so was the Joint Rapid Reaction Force. And yet it seems puzzling that it should have been seen as radical when it seems so self-evidently to be the way in which things should be done.
And these magnificent aircraft carriers, which a quarter of a century later are in existence, one of them seems to constantly be have problems, but nonetheless, in terms of the concept of them, they allow Britain to project power pretty much anywhere in the world. Those were also the brainchild of that strategic review, weren't they?
They were, because we were talking about power projection, but we were also talking about the ability to be flexible. So aircraft carriers can have planes. They're basically floating and mobile runways. They can carry helicopters. They can carry troops. They can also be basically mobile headquarters for any operation that is going to be required in conflict situations. And people sort of ridicule them now and say they're giant white elephants, and they can be taken out with one missile and the rest of it. But if they're so outdated as a concept, why are the Chinese building so many of them? Why do the Americans rely on carrier battle groups to effectively carry American influence into various parts of the globe? So they still have a big role to play. I hope that the HMS Prince of Wales manages to get its design problems sorted out, because it's a bit of an embarrassment at the moment. But when the two aircraft carriers are there, they will be very significant assets for the United Kingdom.
You mentioned Chinese aircraft carriers, and you're right, they are building them at a terrifying rate, aren't they? The largest amount of money ever spent in history on rearmament. We heard just the other day. It's a nerve-wracking concept, isn't it? That the Chinese Communist Party also want to project power anywhere else in the world.
Well, they do, and they do it in an organized way. They've got a concept of strategy, overall national strategy, that we seem to have lost, and it's long term. So it's not just building aircraft carriers, it's not just militarizing tiny atolls in the South China Sea. It's the Belt and Road policy, which extends diplomatic and commercial influence into large numbers of countries in the world. It's the domination of the cyber world. The select committee I'm on in the House of Lords at the present moment is looking at the Arctic. Of course, China is using the reliance on them by the Russians to get access to that northern polar route, which will have a huge beneficial effect on China by giving it a route to the west, that it doesn't have to go around the Cape of around South Africa and the Suez Canal. So the Chinese policy is one of long-term strategic thinking, and we need to be aware of it and plan accordingly. I fear we're way behind the curve on that at the moment.
In 1999, you became the 10th Secretary General of NATO, leading it until 2003. Do you ever think about what might have happened if NATO hadn't been founded back in the April of 1949? Those giants that came around the table and created this, in many ways, the most successful defensive military alliance in history. What if that actually hadn't happened? What if the Americans hadn't been that engaged? What if the sheer sort of statesmanship hadn't existed back in 1949?
Well, I often rehearse that very question in a number of speeches that I made when I was at NATO. And the answer to the question is we would be trying to create it and probably failing. We would have wanted it deeply because you would have wanted to have at least an informal alliance between the United States and the European countries, which would have allowed America to be engaged in Western security and would have multiplied the security of the United States. But I read the debates in the Senate in 1949 when they debated especially Article 5 and the strength of feeling that there was by the Americans at that time that this was, as one of them said, these Europeans will get themselves into another war and expect us to fight it for them. They were very reluctant to actually do it then. How much more reluctant would they be now to endorse a treaty that said an attack on Luxembourg is to be seen as an attack on the United States of America? So it's an invaluable invention, a remarkable one, and one in which we base our collective and indeed our own national security as well.
Let's talk about one of the worst attacks on the United States of America in history. You were Secretary General at the time of 9/11. What are your memories of that particular day?
Well, like so many other people, we were taken aback. I heard about it at a meeting of ambassadors, which was interrupted unprecedentedly with the news that something grave had happened in New York. We went back to NATO headquarters, and I stood like everybody else watching the television pictures, and then became conscious that, of course, we weren't just spectators. We were players. We were running NATO. The collective security alliance in America had been attacked. Not only that, we were on the flight path of Zaventem Airport, Belgium's national airport. And at that time, we didn't know whether there were more airliners in the sky going to be used in the way that the terrorists used them in New York. So we had to get down to it. We had to realize we weren't just watching. We had to be participants, and that's when we started thinking about the idea that perhaps Article 5, that famous self-defense clause, might be relevant in this situation. Now that wasn't automatically apparent to everybody in the room. I argued that is what it had been intended for. Other people said, no, it was intended for a Soviet attack on the West, and not, something in response to a terrorist attack or civilian airliners being used against big buildings in New York. But
essentially, you were having a historical discussion. You were having a debate about history, about what the founders were considering back in 1949.
Absolutely. No, we were rooted in that. And a lot of people were reading Article 5 for the first time. We knew about it. Everybody knew what it was, but most people hadn't actually read how clever it had been constructed in order to get the American Senate to endorse the treaty at that time. So yes, we were embroiled in it, and of course the other side of the Atlantic, we were talking to people to whom it seemed very strange. I said to Colin Powell, Article 5, and he said, yeah, I know what Article 5 is. Why are you mentioning it? And I said, you've been attacked. I said, So, we were living through a moment of historical context, and yet relating it to something that was very, very current.
And how do you think history will view the Western response to that atrocity?
Well, when I read out the statement, because it was a statement by the North Atlantic Council, which had been arrived at, I must say, after a lot of deliberation and quite a bit.
You were president of the North Atlantic Council as well as of NATO, weren't you?
Yep.
Can you just remind our listeners the difference between them?
Well, it's an interesting distinction, because I was the 10th Secretary General of NATO and the chairman of the North Atlantic Council. Unlike the United Nations, NATO decided to make the Secretary General chairman of the NATO Council, the North Atlantic Council, which gives the Secretary General considerable influence, where the Secretary General of the United Nations is basically subject to the whims of the rotating presidency of the Security Council. So I am both head of the organization, and I'm also chairman of the College of Ambassadors, who are permanent representatives to NATO. So in this situation, we had to draw up a draft agreement and then sell it to the other 18 ambassadors round the table who all had to go to 18 governments back home, some of whom were a bit reluctant, and wanted more time to think about it, So I had to use pretty well all the political skills I've acquired over the years, basically, to cajole, bully, persuade, sell the idea to a number of countries. And eventually, in one case, I spoke to the whole cabinet through the foreign minister's mobile phone in order to get over the point. Now, of course, the following day, everybody thought it was their idea, and it was, by and large, the best idea anybody had ever thought of, because it came at a moment where America valued that tangible signal of solidarity with them at a time when they had been under attack for the first time since Pearl Harbor.
You've met President Putin 9 times in the course of your career. What's he like?
Well, what he was like when I met him was interesting. Sober, quiet, little bit sinister, but actually quite open at times. I can tell jokes told by Vladimir Putin, which is not somebody anybody can do now. And maybe if they did, they would end up in jail. Good
jokes. Funny jokes. He's got a sense of humour, has he?
Well, he did, yeah. Well, when we launched the NATO-Russia Council, at the end of the tour de table, each of the presidents and prime ministers had 3 minutes. So they all did their 3 minutes, and I was ready to wind up the session when he put his hand up and wanted the floor. So I must say I was taken aback, because I thought if he gets another speech, they'll all want another speech. Anyway, he said, I just wanted to say, Mr. Secretary General, that you've told us that you are the chairman of the North Atlantic Council, and you're also the chairman of the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, and now you are the chairman of the NATO-Russia Council. Can I suggest that NATO headquarters might be renamed the House of Councils? Now, the joke here is that the Russian word for councils is Soviets. So the interpreters were telling people around the table that Putin was saying, we'll call NATO headquarters the House of Soviets, and I saw the Polish delegation looking horrified. So I took my gavel and said, I pronounced that was a joke, and it was. So anyway, he's not telling any jokes now. So this is a man who was by and large very controlled. He was calm, very sober, serious most of the time, and yet there were flashes of emotion in some of the sessions that I had with him, which showed that there was something in him that was actually quite passionate and not as controlled as he often showed in public.
And you've said that given different statesmanship, Russia might even have joined NATO. How could the West have gone about trying to draw Russia into NATO? Was that ever really a possibility, do you think?
I often speculate on that, and I may even be writing about it in the next few weeks, to say, was there a moment in time where his ambition was to be around that table as an equal? Not the NATO-Russia table, but the North Atlantic Council table. I don't know, and maybe the answer is no. He never, ever thought of that at all. But there was an opportunity at that time for sucking him in. In the way, let's use the other historical comparison. What the French decided to do with the Germans and the European Union. They were determined that Germany was never going to do to France what it did twice in the 20th century. And therefore, what you did was you created an organism like the European Union or the European Community, and you tied Germany in with iron hoops into that spider's web of relationships, committees, debates, discussions, so that they would never again sort of feel that they were going to dominate the rest of Europe. Now, we might have been able to do that with Russia, under Putin. He could have made that decision. He said to me at the first meeting, I want Russia to be part of Western Europe. I believe that is our destiny. And he said, he waved down the table and said, these guys don't agree with me, but that is what I want to achieve. So there may have been a moment at that point where we might have been able to grab hold of him as part of that Western Europe concept. Who knows?
And he's, of course, completely turned his back on that now, or at least ever since February 2022, which was in part the result of his view of history and Ukraine's place in the Russian sphere, essentially. I mean, he obviously does have, and he wrote that 6,500-word article about the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. He does have a powerful historical sense that Ukraine doesn't deserve independence, isn't genuinely independent, and can't be independent, even though it was independent for 30 years before he invaded. How important do you think history and a sense of the past is to Putin?
Well, it is, but it's his version of history. That's the problem. There's the old thing they said about Northern Ireland, that you can respect history, you don't have to live in it. And I think that Putin has now decided his version of history and he wants to live in it. He stood beside me on the 28th of May 2002, and I've got the transcript of the press conference when he said explicitly, he said, Ukraine is a sovereign, independent nation state, and it will make its own decisions about security. So that's what he said in 2002. But then during the pandemic, it appears that he sort of retreated not only into the isolation of the Dachau, but into his version of the history of Russia and its greatness. So he wasn't any longer looking for equality around the North Atlantic Council table. He was looking for equality with the United States of America and building a historical delusion in order to justify what he was going to brutally do to the next door country. And I think a lot of it had to do with psychology and to do with the pandemic and to do with being on his own and being remote and crucially, not being subject to any kind of challenge. You mentioned the essay. Well, the essay I don't think he wrote, but anyway, it reflected his thinking. But the speech that he recently gave to the Duma and the Federation Council, a 2-hour-long speech, I read the translation of that. And I also watched clips of the audience. And the audience is made up of people who've got their kids at English public schools. They've got money and companies registered in London and the south of France. They've got holiday homes in the Hamptons in America. And they're sitting listening to this garbled rubbish, because it was. This wasn't even the serried historical arguments that he had in the big essay. It was a stream of consciousness, of bile and hatred and emotion. And these guys listening, without any animation at all, must surely have been wondering whether this guy was actually sane and whether he was leading them in a way that respected their own particular ambitions.
But dictatorships are like that, aren't they? I mean, throughout history, people have sat and sort of nodded and applauded and stood up and clapped when they know that the person who's speaking is only just this side of insane. It's a well-known thing in dictatorships, isn't it?
Well, yeah, that's right. But last month I was in Bucharest in Romania, and President Ceausescu, who ran a very brutal, highly organized dictatorship, thought he was safe until he took to that balcony and the crowd started to heckle him. So there are moments in history, as you know better probably than I do, where it just cracks. There's just a moment at which the credibility disappears and the system and the dictatorship cracks.
And another byproduct of this invasion, the Ukraine invasion, of course, has been for NATO, has been the accession of Sweden and shortly of Finland, and shortly after that, Finland. Is there any danger to NATO to expand in this way, or does it make perfect sense that we should have a near neighbour of Russia's like Finland as a member? That's the first thing. And secondly, Boris Johnson in the House of Commons the other day said that he wants Ukraine to join NATO. What's your feeling about that?
Well, let's come to that next. Finland, Sweden. You used an interesting word when you described it, which was expanding, NATO expanding. I think that's the wrong word, because NATO enlarged. Because individual countries all made individual decisions. And NATO is not some giant sort of amorphous organization. A mistake that Vladimir Putin makes. It's a very tiny civil service. It's made up of sovereign independent nation states. And they're troublesome, and they're fractious, and they're difficult to corral, and getting them to make decisions, is long and painful as a process. But it's NATO enlarged by these individual countries all deciding that they would subordinate a degree of sovereignty to this organization, but never gave it up completely.
But it's not going to become more unwieldy now that we've got two more nations. We're up to, 31 nations. It sounds pretty unwieldy even before.
Yeah, well, it's not going to be easy to control. I found it complex and difficult with 19 countries. So Stoltenberg's got a much bigger problem dealing with it. And one of the things that disappears with size is the ability to debate issues. In my time, we had, around the council table, we had genuine debates, arguments, and some of them quite emotive. And in one case, I had to stop the debate, adjourn the meeting, because tempers were flaring over an exercise to do with that. But when you've got 31, 32 countries, that's going to be more difficult. But yet, they all know that it is so valuable and important for them that at the end of the day, they subordinate a lot of the individual views to the collective good. And that's the great, enormous success of NATO. To make a decision, you have to get consensus. Once you've got consensus, you need consensus to break that decision. An interesting concept most people don't sufficiently understand.
You mentioned Charles de Gaulle earlier on in this conversation. Of course, he broke the consensus, didn't he, when he took France out of NATO. France then went back into NATO. With President Macron, before the invasion of Ukraine, saying that NATO was brain dead, one wondered whether or not the French were committed to NATO, but they very obviously are. But what do you feel about President Macron's seeming appeasement over China and questioning whether or not the West would be firm over Taiwan, for example? Do you fear that there's a problem for the West with regard to France's stance?
Well, France has always been an uncomfortable member of the Western alliance, but at the end of the day, the French are robust and important and a key part of it. An interesting little thing from your historian point of view, just let me say to you, it was President Sarkozy who finally took France back into the military structure of NATO, which is what de Gaulle had withdrawn from a way back. President Chirac sort of wobbled close to NATO, but wasn't willing to make the final move, despite concessions made to him. President Sarkozy, who was a conservative, then got basically the shadow foreign secretary, the socialist Foreign Minister, Hubert Védrine, to write a report on France and NATO membership. A remarkable document was produced, by the opposition. And Sarkozy then said, right, we're going to go back into to the military structure. There's a lot to be said against Sarkozy as a president, but that was an act of brilliance, because it sort of united both sides, and France then, holus bolus, went back into the structure that they'd stayed out of for so long. So France can be both a unifier and a divisive force at times. And Macron at the moment knows that there's a vacuum of leadership. Britain outside of the European Union, Germany sort of finding a new role, Italy going through its usual sort of agonies. So he's basically there as the leader, and that takes him in a variety of directions. I'm not entirely sure that appeasement is the word in relation to China. I think he takes a very pragmatic view that is different to the United States, in as much as he wants to have a relationship with China that will eventually control its more, sort of aggressive instincts. And that I think is why, he went to see Xi Jinping and came back with that conclusion. But you have to understand that France is desperately wanting to be part of a club, but at the same time being a very different member of that club.
And to go back to the question about Boris Johnson, do you think that Ukraine could be a member of that club?
I think it could eventually. The decision was taken in 2008, prematurely, in my view, to say Ukraine and Georgia will become members of the alliance, because first of all, that was highly upsetting to the Russians. And although that shouldn't be a particular factor in our consideration, it wasn't a good thing to do at the time, because it also subverted the process. The process of joining NATO is that you basically have to pass a number of tests, not as formalized as they are for the European Union, but there's a whole series of tests like good neighborly relations, compatibility of your armed forces, with the NATO structures, sustainable democratic structures, anti-corruption laws, all of these things. So, in 2008, Ukraine was nowhere near that. So it was premature. But once this conflict is over, and as I hope Ukraine prevails, I think Ukraine will then be well on the road to be a country that would fit within most of the criteria that has been laid down in the past.
And on that very positive note, let me ask you what I ask every one of my guests. Firstly, what's your favourite counterfactual, your historical counterfactual, George? What if of history?
Well, I thought about that. And one bit of me was saying, what if the Kaiser had not declared a war on all shipping in the end of the First World War? Because it was that decision that brought the United States of America into the First World War. My grandfather played a role in rescuing some soldiers who came to grief off the coast of the island of Islay in the last year of the war. But I reconsidered that view, and I want, therefore, to go to August the 27th, 1776, after the Battle of Long Island, when General Howe's forces had defeated the forces of General George Washington, and decided, having defeated them, that they would leave the defeated forces on the borders of the Hudson overnight and then wipe them out or wipe them up the following day. And overnight, led and organised by a man from Port Ellen in Islay, which is where I was born, Major General Alexander MacDougall, the whole of the Revolutionary Army, 9,000 troops. All their equipment and all their food were taken across the River Hudson, aided by seamanship of some incredible quality, because it's a mile wide.
And it was very foggy. We've got to, the weather was on their side as well, and it has to be added as well. They were very lucky with the weather as well, on that day.
To do with that, but it was a remarkable achievement. And what if the fog had not been there? What if General Howe had actually decided to wipe them out overnight? Then history would have been very, very different. But General MacDougall went on eventually to be the first Minister of the Marine of the United States of America and the first President of the Bank of New York. And that was a boy from Port Helen in Iowa.
Well, that's a good one. And what about which history book or biography are you reading at the moment?
Well, the one that I've chosen is called Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg by somebody called Francine Hirsch, which was the Nuremberg trials from the Soviet point of view, focusing on the Soviet side. Absolutely fascinating, because it was quite clear that Stalin wanted war crimes trials, but based on his idea of a trial, which was you're guilty and now we'll have the trial, and was therefore, completely confounded by the idea that the Allies were going to do it properly with defense councils. But the other thing that I think is remarkable in this book and relevant to what's happening in Ukraine today is that the Soviet Union, Stalin personally, wanted the crime of aggression to be one of the accusations against the Nazis. That didn't exist before, and the Allies were reluctant to do it. But he got the crime of aggression to be one of the prosecution elements at that trial. And it's interesting now, that we're talking about what has happened in Ukraine. Maybe that particular move that they made at that time might come back to haunt them.
He also wanted at the, I think it was the Potsdam conference, he said that he wanted 50,000 Germans shot after the war, and the trials were going to be, as you say, extremely quick. And Churchill actually got up and left the meeting. He walked out sooner than go along with the mass shootings. That sounds like an absolutely fascinating. But what was the name of the author again?
Francine Hirsch.
Francine Hirsch.
Hirsch.
Splendid. Thank you very much.
But it's full of little vignettes that are really sort of incredibly interesting. Because the Russians the Soviets were faced with the mountains of documents that had to be analysed as part of the evidence, and they had virtually nobody left in Russia, who was a German expert or a German speaker, because they all got shot, during the war. And the chief prosecutor they put up was a guy from Ukraine, actually a Ukrainian man who'd done most of the show trials and who was completely out of his depth in this concept of a fair trial.
I think Wyszynski was still in a key position at Nuremberg as well, wasn't he? The monster. George Robertson, Lord Robertson, thank you very much indeed for appearing on Secrets of Statecraft.
Been a very interesting experience for me as well, Andrew. Thank you.
Fantastic. My thanks to George Robertson. Coming up on the next Secrets of Statecraft podcast is Tony Abbott, Prime Minister of Australia from 2013 to 2015.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society and improve the human condition. For more information about our work, or to listen to more of our podcast or watch our videos, please visit hoover.org.